The small town of Millersville had always been quiet, nestled between rolling hills and endless stretches of farmland. But the cornfield just outside the town had a darker reputation, a place whispered about around campfires and avoided by even the bravest locals. It wasn't just because of its size, a sprawling 50-acre sea of towering stalks, or its eerie isolation. It was because of the farmer who disappeared. Old Man Greeley had been tending that field for decades. By all accounts, he was a man of routine and stability. Until one autumn night, 10 years ago, when he vanished without a trace. His tractor was found parked at the edge of the field, the engine still warm. His dog, Scout, was found circling the area, whining, but Greeley was never seen again. Rumors spread like wildfire. Some said he'd been taken by aliens. Others spoke of a vengeful spirit protecting the land. Locals reported seeing strange lights hovering above the field and hearing whispers in the wind when they got too close. But the most chilling tale was that of the cornfield keeper, a ghostly figure said to roam the stalks at night, ensuring no one disturbed the field. It was this story that intrigued Emma, Jake, Laura, and Ben. The four friends had grown up together in Millersville and were no strangers to the local legends. But Emma, ever the skeptic, was convinced it was all nonsense. "There's no such thing as ghosts," she'd said one chilly October evening. "Let's go out there and prove it." The others hesitated, but Emma's confidence was contagious. By midnight, they stood at the edge of the cornfield, flashlights in hand, and the full moon casting long shadows across the rows of stalks. "Okay," Jake said, his voice tinged with nervousness. "We go in, walk to the middle, and come right back out. 10 minutes tops." Laura nodded, clutching her flashlight tightly. "Just don't wander off. These things are like mazes." Ben, the quietest of the group, adjusted his backpack and muttered, "Let's just get this over with." The cornfield seemed to close around them as they stepped between the stalks. The air was thick with the earthy scent of the soil, and the only sounds were the crunch of their boots and the occasional rustle of leaves in the breeze. The further they went, the darker it got. The moonlight barely penetrated the dense canopy of corn. Emma led the way, her flashlight cutting through the darkness. See? Nothing but corn. No lights, no whispers, no ghost. But as they moved deeper into the field, the atmosphere shifted. The wind died down, leaving an unsettling silence. The stalks seemed to grow taller, their shadows twisting and merging into strange shapes. "I don't like this," Laura whispered, glancing over her shoulder. "It feels different." Jake stopped abruptly. "Did you hear that?" The group froze, straining to listen. At first there was nothing, but then, faintly, came a sound, a low, melodic hum, almost like a song. It seemed to come from all around them, echoing through the stalks. "That's just the wind," Emma said, though her voice wavered. "Wind doesn't hum," Ben muttered. The group pressed on, now huddled closer together. The hum grew louder, morphing into whispers that seemed to brush against their ears. Snatches of words floated through the air, indecipherable, but filled with malice. "We should turn back," Laura said, her voice trembling. Emma hesitated but nodded. "Fine, let's go." But as they turned, they realized they couldn't tell which direction they'd come from. The rows of corn looked identical, stretching endlessly in every direction. "We're not lost," Emma said, trying to sound confident. "We just need to keep calm." And her words were cut off by a sudden, blinding flash of light. It wasn't like lightning. It was a pulsating, unnatural glow that lit up the field in eerie hues of green and blue. The whispers grew louder, almost a chant now, as if the field itself was alive. "Run," Jake shouted, grabbing Laura's hand. The group sprinted through the rows, stalks slapping against their faces and arms. The light followed them, growing brighter, and the whispers turned into guttural growls. Ben stumbled and fell, his flashlight tumbling into the dirt. "Ben!" Emma screamed, skidding to a stop. He scrambled to his feet, but before he could grab his flashlight, something emerged from the stalks, a figure, tall and gaunt, shrouded in shadow. Its eyes glowed like embers, and its face was a grotesque mask of twisted flesh. It stood perfectly still, watching them. "Go!" Ben yelled, shoving Emma forward. The figure moved then, gliding toward them without a sound. The group ran, adrenaline fueling their panicked flight. The light grew brighter, the whispers deafening, and the figure was always just behind them, no matter how fast they ran. Finally, they burst out of the field and onto the dirt road. The whispers ceased, and the light vanished, leaving only the pale glow of the moon. The group collapsed on the ground, gasping for breath. When they looked back, the cornfield was silent and still. There was no sign of the figure or the lights, but they weren't alone. Parked at the edge of the field was a rusted tractor, its engine cold. Sitting in the seat was a tattered hat they recognized from old photos. It was Old Man Greeley's. Without a word, they scrambled into their car and sped back to town. They never spoke of what they saw that night, but none of them ever returned to the cornfield. Locals say the field still stands, untouched and thriving. Every so often, a newcomer to Millersville will try to explore it, drawn by the stories, but they never come back. And the hum of the whispers continues, waiting for the next trespasser. They called it the Devil's Sentinel, a scarecrow standing in the middle of an abandoned cornfield on the outskirts of town. For years, stories had swirled around it, whispering of a vengeful spirit bound to its straw-filled body. They said it moved under the cover of darkness, its stitched mouth curling into a wicked grin as it sought revenge on anyone foolish enough to trespass. I didn't believe a word of it. My name is David Cross, and I'm a freelance journalist. Ghost stories and urban legends were my bread and butter, the kind of content that brought clicks and paid the bills. When I heard about the cursed scarecrow from a friend in a neighboring town, I knew I had my next story. Armed with nothing but my camera, a flashlight, and a healthy dose of skepticism, I decided to spend the night in the infamous cornfield to prove the stories were nothing more than small-town superstition. Before setting out, I did my research. The scarecrow's origins were tied to a man named Elias Grady, a farmer who lived on the land over 70 years ago. Grady was known as a recluse, the kind of man who rarely spoke to anyone. But he was fiercely protective of his cornfield, especially after a string of thefts during a poor harvest season. The story went that Grady spent weeks crafting the scarecrow, imbuing it with a piece of his soul to guard his field. He used his own clothes to dress it, and stitched the burlap face with a obsessive precision. Some claimed he performed dark rituals under the full moon, binding the scarecrow to his will. Not long after, Grady was found dead in his barn, hanging from the rafters. The field was abandoned soon after, and the scarecrow left to rot. But according to legend, it never did. It remained pristine, untouched by time, and those who dared to visit the field claimed it wasn't just a lifeless figure. They said it watched them. It was just past 10 p.m. when I parked my car at the edge of the overgrown property. The cornfield stretched before me, a sea of shadows under the pale moonlight. The air was heavy, the kind of stillness that made your skin crawl. But I shrugged it off, grabbing my gear and heading toward the field. I spotted the scarecrow immediately. It stood in the center, its tattered coat fluttering in the faint breeze. From a distance, it looked ordinary enough, just a roughly human-shaped figure stuffed with straw. I couldn't understand what all the fuss was about. I set up my camera on a tripod about 20 feet from the scarecrow. The plan was simple: record through the night and document anything unusual. To pass the time, I decided to explore the field. The cornfield was eerily quiet. No crickets, no rustling leaves, just the sound of my own footsteps crunching against the dry soil. As I walked deeper into the field, I noticed something strange. The stalks seemed wrong. They were too tall, their shapes distorted in the moonlight. Some looked like twisted figures, their leaves reaching out like skeletal arms. I shook my head, blaming my overactive imagination. Still, the unease lingered, crawling up my spine as I made my way back to the scarecrow. When I returned, I froze. The scarecrow had moved. It was subtle, almost imperceptible, but I was sure of it. Its head was tilted slightly to the left, the burlap face angled toward me. My rational mind immediately kicked in. Maybe the wind shifted it. Maybe the uneven ground caused the pole to lean. I grabbed my flashlight and shone it on the figure. The stitched mouth seemed different. What had been a straight line now looked slightly curved, as if it was smirking. My pulse quickened, but I dismissed it. I was letting the stories get to me. Hours passed. Midnight came and went. The camera continued recording, and I sat in my camping chair, flipping through a notebook of local interviews I'd collected about the scarecrow. The accounts were varied but eerily consistent: shadows moving in the field, the feeling of being watched, whispers in the dark. It was then I heard it. A faint murmur carried on the wind. At first I thought it was my imagination, but it grew louder, more distinct. It wasn't a single voice, it was a chorus, whispering in low, guttural tones. I couldn't make out the words, but they sounded angry, accusing. "Hello?" I called out, my voice cracking slightly. "Is someone there?" No response. Just the whispers circling me like a predator stalking its prey. My flashlight beam cut through the darkness, revealing nothing but corn. And then I saw it. The scarecrow's head was turned fully toward me now, its glowing, stitched eyes locked onto mine. My breath caught in my throat as I stumbled backward, tripping over my chair. The whispers intensified, becoming a deafening roar. The scarecrow shifted again, its arms twitching unnaturally as if struggling against invisible strings. I grabbed my camera and bolted into the field. The corn stalks closed around me like a living maze, their leaves slashing at my arms and face. Behind me, I heard the crunch of footsteps, not heavy, but deliberate, dragging. I didn't dare look back. The whispers turned into laughter, mocking and cruel. Shadows darted through the rows, and I felt their cold presence brush against my skin. My flashlight flickered, its beam barely illuminating the path ahead. I burst into a small clearing and froze. The scarecrow was there, standing in the center, its arms outstretched like a grotesque crucifixion. It hadn't just moved, it had beaten me there. "Stay away," I shouted, brandishing the flashlight like a weapon. The scarecrow tilted its head, and the laughter stopped. For a moment, the world was silent, as if holding its breath. Then it lunged. I screamed and ran, blindly crashing through the stalks. My legs burned, my lungs ached, but I didn't stop. The whispers returned, now interspersed with faint, ghostly screams. My flashlight went out completely, leaving me in total darkness. Just when I thought I couldn't go any further, I saw the faint glow of my car's headlights. Summoning the last of my strength, I sprinted toward it. Behind me, the scarecrow's footsteps grew faster, closer. I reached the car, flinging the door open and diving inside. The engine roared to life, and I slammed on the gas. In the rearview mirror, I saw it standing at the edge of the field, its head tilted in that unnerving way. But it didn't follow. It just watched as I sped away, its stitched grin etched into my memory. Back in the safety of my apartment, I reviewed the footage. Most of it was uneventful, just hours of static images of the field. But then, around midnight, the camera captured something horrifying. The scarecrow moved. Its head twisted slowly, its stitched mouth curling into a grin. Its arms stretched outward, bending at impossible angles. And then it stepped down from its pole. The whispers began, faint at first, but growing louder. The scarecrow moved toward the camera, its glowing eyes filling the frame before the footage cut to black. I tried to warn people, but no one believed me. They thought it was a hoax, another fabrication for clicks. But I knew the truth. I haven't been back to the field, and I never will. But sometimes, late at night, I hear the whispers low and accusing, just outside my window. The sun had dipped below the horizon, leaving the world in a deep, shadowy twilight as Daniel navigated his beat-up sedan along the lonely country road. He was hours off course, thanks to his GPS inexplicably losing signal, and his phone was no help. Its battery had died earlier that evening. To make matters worse, his gas tank was nearing empty. The endless cornfields flanking the road offered no sense of comfort, their tall, swaying stalks creating an oppressive tunnel. when a dirt road appeared to his right, marked only by a leaning wooden sign with illegible writing. Desperation won over caution. Maybe there was a farmhouse at the end, someone who could point him in the right direction or lend him a phone. With a hesitant turn of the wheel, Daniel drove into the cornfield. The dirt path stretched on far longer than Daniel had anticipated. The walls of corn seemed to close in as the sky darkened to an inky black, the feeble light from his car's headlights doing little to dispel the shadows. Just as he considered turning back, a flickering orange glow appeared in the distance. Curiosity got the better of him. Leaving his car behind, he stepped out, flashlight in hand. The air was thick with the scent of earth and something metallic, almost like blood. He pushed his way through the stalks, the rustling leaves brushing against his arms like cold fingers. As he neared the light, the sound of chanting reached his ears. Low and rhythmic, the chanting was unlike anything he had ever heard. The words were guttural, foreign, spoken in a cadence that made his skin crawl. The glow became brighter, and as Daniel emerged into a clearing, he froze. At the center of the clearing was a massive bonfire, its flames licking the night sky. Surrounding it stood a circle of hooded figures, their faces obscured by masks carved from wood, each depicting a grotesque, otherworldly visage. In their hands they held staffs adorned with dangling bones and feathers, which they raised in unison as their chants reached a crescendo. But it wasn't just the cultists that caught Daniel's eye. Scattered around the clearing were strange symbols carved into the ground, and even into the stalks of corn. Intricate and alien, the symbols seemed to shimmer in the firelight, pulsing as if alive. In the center of the circle, a stone altar was smeared with something dark, and on it lay a struggling figure, a young woman, her muffled cries barely audible over the chanting. Daniel's breath caught in his throat. His instinct was to run, but his legs felt rooted to the ground. He watched in horror as one of the cultists stepped forward, their staff raised high. The chanting slowed, turning into a haunting hum. The leader began to speak, their voice unnervingly deep. In the name of the keeper of the stalks, we offer this blood, that the harvest may thrive and the veil remain unbroken. The staff came down with a sickening thud. Daniel's flashlight slipped from his trembling hands, hitting the ground with a dull thump. The sound drew the attention of one of the cultists, their masked face snapping toward him like a predator spotting prey. For a moment, there was silence. Then chaos erupted. "There's someone here," a voice hissed from beneath one of the masks. Daniel turned and ran, plunging back into the cornfield. Behind him, the chanting was replaced by shouting, followed by the unmistakable sound of footsteps crashing through the stalks. The cornfield was a maze, its rows disorienting and endless. The flashlight's beam wavered as Daniel sprinted, his heart pounding in his ears. He could hear them closing in, their guttural voices calling to one another. Find him. The intruder must not escape. Daniel stumbled, falling to his knees. His hand landed on something sharp, and he realized it was one of the strange symbols carved into the ground. It seemed to glow faintly, its lines filled with a substance that felt warm and sticky. Panic surged through him as he scrambled to his feet, the distant flicker of the bonfire barely visible now. As he ran deeper into the field, Daniel began to notice more of the symbols. They were carved into the stalks, forming a network of eerie patterns. Some glowed faintly like the one he had fallen on. Others seemed to writhe, the lines shifting and twisting as if alive. The air grew colder, and a faint whispering sound joined the cacophony of his panicked breathing. It wasn't the cultists, it was something else. The whispers were soft, insidious, and they came from everywhere and nowhere at once. You should not have come. The keeper sees you. Daniel clamped his hands over his ears, but the voices burrowed into his mind, their chilling words impossible to block out. His vision blurred, and for a moment he thought he saw shapes moving among the stalks, tall, lanky figures with hollow eyes and elongated limbs, their bodies melding with the corn as they moved. The footsteps were closer now, accompanied by the sound of the cultist staffs beating against the ground. Daniel's chest burned as he pushed himself to keep running, his legs threatening to give out. Just when he thought he couldn't go any farther, he burst into another clearing. This one was smaller, dominated by a single, gnarled tree. Its twisted branches reached skyward like skeletal hands, and at its base was an old, rusted pickup truck. Hope flared in Daniel's chest. If the truck still worked, he could escape. He bolted for the vehicle, yanking open the door and climbing inside. The keys were in the ignition, and with a shaky hand, he turned them. The engine sputtered but didn't start. Behind him, the cultists were closing in, their torches casting flickering shadows through the corn. "Come on, come on," Daniel whispered frantically, trying the key again. This time the engine roared to life. He slammed the door shut, threw the truck into gear, and floored the gas pedal. The truck tore through the cornfield, the stalks snapping and bending under its wheels. In the rearview mirror, Daniel saw the cultists fade into the distance. Relief washed over him, but it was short-lived. As he sped down the dirt road, the whispers returned, louder and more insistent. "You cannot escape. The keeper watches." Suddenly, the symbols carved into the corn stalks began to glow brighter, their light flooding the field. The truck's engine sputtered, the dashboard flickering erratically. The vehicle slowed as if an invisible force was pulling it back. Daniel screamed, slamming his foot on the accelerator, but the truck wouldn't budge. The whispers grew deafening, and through the windshield, he saw them, the tall, lanky figures from before. They stepped out of the corn, their hollow eyes fixed on him, their elongated fingers pointing accusingly. The truck's engine died completely, and the symbol's light enveloped him. The last thing Daniel saw before everything went black was the figure of the cult leader standing in front of the truck, their wooden mask twisted into a grotesque grin. Daniel's car was found abandoned at the edge of the cornfield 2 days later. The authorities combed the area but found no trace of him. Locals who ventured near the field claimed the strange symbols were gone, but the whispers remained. The cornfield, they said, had claimed another soul for the keeper.